Howdy.
Hey there. It's the wandering camera.
Wandering camera, yeah. I thought I'd go ahead and start it. And I go, oh, yeah, it's kind of, I was going to do it outside and it's kind of bright.
Cool.
So there you go. Tour of the house.
Thanks, man.
So, where are you today?
Living corner. We are in, where am I at, darling?
Kansas.
We're in Kansas. I guess the western part of Kansas.
The roaming gnome.
Yeah, we're almost at Colorado. We've been cruising over to the west, meet up with a friend in Colorado.
Okay. Very nice. Put the headphones in. Okay, so I guess we could niceties put away.
Yeah. Well, I'm doing pretty good in the tournament, so I'm in a pretty jovial, easygoing mood anyway. So.
Okay, good job. But I think they're down to 4 people left, or.
Yeah. So the 2 semifinals. I won mine, so I'm going to the finals, and then we'll see what happens on the other one.
And the other one's between Joe and Mike?
It's Joshua Tree Treat versus Metant 3. I haven't quite got everybody's real world names down yet. So
Okay. So not. I must be a little behind in that, but I've been out. I was out round 1, so even though I won, that's a whole other story. I won't go into that.
Yeah, there were a few of those.
Yeah, it was controversial.
Oh, that sucks.
But I won. The judges voted against me, but I won the actual popular vote, as we say.
Gotcha.
So, the title of this one is "The minimum wage should be $0," and this is just the idea we should get rid of the minimum wage altogether.
Right.
You said that you have a libertarian ideal view, but you are more real world. You look at the way the world is. And I mean, so I do agree with that. The world is, and we should make judgments on the world according to how it is. And, there are ideals in which we would seek to push the world towards. Mm-hmm. And I would say that getting rid of a minimum wage would be ideal. Now, if we wanted to go from where the world is, kind of positive economics, and go from there into how it ought to be, and I would say that the minimum wage should not be higher at a minimum, right? So we should not raise the minimum wage, and there's a lot of reasons for that.
Sure. So go over some of them. I've got kind of my case for the minimum wage, so I can do that later, and we can kind of go back and forth on the points.
Okay. So number 1, I think the minimum wage harms the very people in which it claims to help, which are the poor and those with low skills, because the minimum wage should be thought of as rungs on a ladder, right? And you're probably familiar with the argument.
Sure.
That the ladder is it's like the economic ladder in which we all seek to climb to the higher rungs and get on top of the roof, or whatever you want to call it.
As high as you feel like going at any rate.
And as high as, and I think that's important, as high as you would like to go. And a lot of people are willing, and in fact, I mean, we see a lot of people are willing to settle on that lowest rung. And that's for various reasons. And I think we can get into those. I think the welfare state plays a huge role in this, and oftentimes the welfare payments are used as a reason to raise the minimum wage, and I think they have the opposite effect of what the claim would be. If you're familiar with the Robert Reich video that the minimum wage should be $15, it's got hundreds of millions of views or something.
I've watched it. He shows up in my Facebook feed, but I never watched his videos.
Yeah, so he's a lawyer. He's not an economist. He's a lawyer. I think he did do economics as an undergrad or something, but he was a labor secretary for Clinton, and he's got he's big in the left.
Mm-hmm.
He's a very liberal, and he has a $15 an hour now, and cartoon drawings.
Sure.
And I think it's really an absurd argument. His entire argument from start to finish, I think it's 7 points, and they're all terrible and easily refuted. And so maybe I teach economics, so I actually played that, and then for my classes, I
And
always
you
go
critiqued it.
through and reply.
If you'd like to
Yeah.
hear mine first, we can do that. It's probably going to be a little different than
Yeah.
his.
Okay, so yeah, I mean, I've got a few points here, but I would actually like to see what is your exact view on the minimum
Okay.
wage?
So my view on the minimum wage, it shouldn't be 0. It should be X, where X is determined by analyzing the local job market and the local cost of living and making a determination on what a good minimum wage would be that wouldn't impact employment harshly and would allow people who are making a minimum wage, who have jobs where the intent of the job is in order to sustain your family, to be able to make ends meet, aka enough money to rent a small apartment or a small room or what have you, depending on your age and needs, and enough money to feed your family and not run afoul of the law, right? So, and that's because the minimum wage has two purposes, as I see it. One is economic and one is social, right? So the economic argument goes back all the way to Adam Smith, right, and his inequality of bargaining powers. So the problem you have in a market, anytime you have a market, you really want an equilibrium of bargaining power between two people making a contract. In this case, the employer and the employee. Unfortunately, when an employer and employee get together to make a contract and agree upon a wage, they don't have equal bargaining power. The employer has a number of advantages over the employee, and that leads to a price that doesn't actually reflect the full value of the person's labor. Because of this, it's sort of like if I were to negotiate a deal with a guy that had a gun to my head and said, if you don't get this deal done in 10 seconds, I'm going to pull the trigger. I'm going to make a worse deal than you are if you have 10 hours, right, to wait before something bad happens. So unequal bargaining means you don't get a good equilibrium price. So the reasons that it's unequal are as follows. There are limited employers within a given area that a person is looking for a job in, and their power and the size in the labor market is much higher in proportion to an individual worker. Second, the workers who cannot find jobs face immediate financial collapse and hardship, as where the employer often has the funds and the capital in order to wait out the worker. So the worker is going to immediately start to not be able to pay their rent, as well the worker can kind of sit around and wait a little while. They're going to make less money, but they're still going to be solvent most likely, so they can wait for the worker to come around. Third, employers tend to have a much better idea about the local job market, the going prices, the kinds of values they can get from people, and they also have the ability to hire experts in negotiation in order to make the salary negotiations for them, as where the individual worker doesn't have these kinds of advantages. Large employers can bring in foreign workers from other areas as a source of cheap labor, or outsource their production, which is another advantage, that they can just sort of wall off local workers in their area. 5, employees are limited by their given experience in what jobs they can apply for, as where corporations can hire a wide range of different people in different professions, so they have a larger pool to draw from, especially for the lower end. And 6, there's intense social pressure for people to have a job. If you don't have a job, you're a bum, dude, you're lazy, whatever it happens to be. So if you're holding out, trying to negotiate a good deal, then you're seen by society as a leech or a scum, when really what you're trying to do is stand up for your bargaining rights. So these are 6 reasons why individual employers have a significant disadvantage when negotiating, and that makes for a bad equilibrium price. So the consequences of this, the reason this is a problem, is it ends up putting people, aside from a pure economics perspective, it puts people into a social situation where they, basically can't afford the full cost of living, especially in urban areas where the price of living is high. So you have trouble paying your rent, you have trouble making ends meet in food, you have trouble paying the electricity bill and the light bill and your car insurance and your tabs and all these different things that are kind of required by our society in order to meet the basic standards of living, to get your kids educated and so on and so forth. There's all kinds of costs. And, if you're not able to get your full value of your labor and your negotiating power, you end up in kind of this terrible catch-22 where you either don't have a job, you go on welfare, face a lot of stigma, still don't really have enough money to make ends meet, or you get a job, it incurs additional costs for transportation, childcare, things like that, and you're still not making enough money. So you get in kind of a bad situation because you don't have that kind of bargaining power. So the minimum wage is aimed at these two things, or it should be aimed at these two things. It shouldn't just be some political thing, save the poor, right? It should be about evening up the score a little bit on the lower rung, just creating a floor below which people can't negotiate, can't be pressured to go too low, and to try and alleviate the problem of the inequality, people who just can't make a living, meet that minimum bar of costs. Because when they can't do that, you get slums and you get blight, you get crime. Eventually, like in the Gilded Age, when we didn't have any minimum wage and laissez-faire capitalism just kind of run rampant, you had the largest movements for socialism, communism, and anarchy that the country's ever seen because of that kind of great inequality. And that sort of social disruption, bad for society, bad for capitalism. It led to a lot of the reforms that capitalists don't like. So that's kind of my overall push for why minimum wage matters. Now, I think you don't just set a number like $15 an hour for everybody. That doesn't work, because minimum wage in, say, Seattle, right, where they have a really high minimum wage now, is a very different kind of labor market than, say, Bozeman, Montana, right, where you got a looser labor market. So different minimum wage is going to have a big impact. You don't just want blankets. You want to carefully pick in a given area what's going to work and alleviate the pressures that you've got for cost of living. So that's my deal.
Okay, so one, you talked about area, and you actually started and finished with the idea of having a city-based minimum wage.
I think it's best that way. Yeah.
Which, if you're going to have a minimum wage, having a city-based minimum wage is the least awful way to go. I think you could even say as far as minimum wage goes, it's the best option. Here in Washington, they have a $15 an hour minimum wage. In Seattle, and it's 14 if you're 16 to 18 years old, it's 14. So
it's phased in various ways.
Yeah, and so you could do it that way as well. Have it kind of started. It should start. I mean, $14 an hour for a 16-year-old is just a fortune, actually.
Well, yeah, and
I made
let me add that
I made $5 an hour. So. When I was 16.
Oh, yeah. I made a little bit more than that.
I made below minimum wage. By the way, I made below minimum wage. I always say this because I had to pay union. I made 10 cents over, but I had to pay union dues, which equated to my 10 hours a week was $1 an hour, right? I earned an extra $1 a week, and I had to pay $14, I think, per 2 weeks in. So I was losing $6 a week.
Yeah, I've never been
due to the union dues.
In theory, they should be doing a better job for you, right?
Well, unions, I mean, this is another example. Unions tend to build themselves on the backs of the lowest level of people, the courtesy clerks, right? Because these are people that kind of come in, go out. Yeah. They're on a whim.
I mean, most of them are on young skilled manufacturing jobs and stuff, right? And teachers and kind of that middle rung these days. But yeah.
Yeah. Well, in the grocery example, it's the courtesy clerk is the person that makes the minimum wage, right? So I think this is a perfect example of societies of minimum wage as a whole, is that it pretends to help the lowest class of worker, the lowest skilled worker, by maintaining a floor for them. But in reality, what it does is it actually harms the person with the least amount of skills, because it makes it much more difficult for them to actually get that first job. So, I mean, if $15 an hour is the minimum wage, then in a city like Seattle, where you have a pretty high demand for labor, just because Amazon has come in and they bought everything, and there's a lot of Amazonians to serve food to.
I think they're at 2.6% unemployment in Seattle, which is crazy good.
Yeah, and you talked about cost of living, and Seattle is a very expensive place to live.
I lived there. That's where I came from.
Oh, that's right, because you were.
Yeah, about 22 months ago, I lived in Seattle. Yeah. By selling my house in that crazy labor market is how I get to travel around the country. So,
yeah. So, Seattle is perhaps the most leftist, and again, I would say liberal, but more so, they are actually leftist city in the country, and it's a horrible place to live.
I disagree strongly, but I loved it.
So I don't. It could be a beautiful city, but the incentives that they've created for. You walk out of your front door of could be your house, and you got to ask the guy to move his tent off the sidewalk in front of your house.
Never had that problem.
Right? That is everywhere in Seattle. So I know people they can't get out of their building because there's somebody sleeping in their doorway.
Are you talking about downtown?
And yeah, Yeah, downtown there are tents
Some
everywhere.
homeless people, yeah.
On the sidewalk where people
That's
are
true of
walking
every
around,
major
right?
metropolitan
They're on the
area.
basketball courts.
You can't find a
Not
major city without
no,
homeless people
not
in
over
it.
here.
Yeah,
Well, no,
what city do you live in?
I'm not talking about homeless. I'm talking about, well, I live across the water in Bellevue.
Yeah, well, yeah, homeless people don't come to Bellevue much.
It's because they don't put up with that shit.
Sure, well, yeah.
So they don't incentivize it. So you can, open air drug. And again, I think this is the Seattle, very liberal Seattle leftist, right? Not just liberal, but actually leftist, which is the extreme viewpoints of the left. Right, taking them to the kind of
Well,
to the ends.
I don't know. You have to go to Cuba or Venezuela for that, really. I mean, Seattle is a
I don't
merchant
know.
capital,
Seattle's
right?
very close.
I mean, but
Seattle's very close. So they have.
I think that's pretty
So,
solid.
anyways,
But all right.
So those who have never been to Seattle, look up Seattle garbage, okay, and you'll see pictures of tents and massive piles of garbage on the sidewalk right in the middle of downtown.
I've been downtown many
Insane.
times, never seen that.
It's completely insane. Down by the water, there's tents on this. Yeah, I mean tents on the sidewalk. People.
No,
in fact, I work
the freeway
down,
but I know.
Sort of, but they're on the sidewalk in popular areas. They've had them on fields, and there was
It's also one of the richest
on the
cities
basketball
in the
court.
nation, by the way.
Well, you mean highest per capita income, but again, that's because of Amazon, Microsoft.
Yeah, but that's the thing, though. Is
basically,
all right. Look,
before Amazon came here, it really wasn't anything. So
now there's
we're
kind of for many years. So,
well, no, before Amazon, they remember 1970s. Boeing was here. Microsoft was kind of coming in, but they said the last one out, turn the lights off.
Hey, that's because Boeing had a recession.
Seattle and
drove Boeing-based economy.
And Boeing has always been like that, though. They'll go up and down. You lived here, so do you remember Almost Live?
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, totally.
Yeah, they used to make fun of they had like the Pike or Pine thing, and it was kind of a Jeopardy style. Is it Pike or is it Pine? And they had the guy, asking him like discount store. Is it Pike? He's, oh yeah, Pike. Secondhand goods, Pine. Right? He knows where all the cheap stuff is. But yeah, Seattle has Amazon is there. There's a lot of Expedia moved in from Bellevue. They moved over to Seattle, and you have a lot of tech. Now, I would say tech is the least. In fact, most people say that tech is the least regulated industry in the United States.
Yeah, pretty much.
And they are, and there's a reason for that. That's why they're exploding. That's why there's so much money in tech. That's why you have Silicon Valley, and we are the Silicon Valley.
It's just very powerful,
because of the sport. Well, it's because of the lack of regulation. No. You get a lot of.
I disagree. I was a software development engineer for 25 years, so I know the tech industry pretty well, and it really had nothing to do with regulation. The fact is that technology.
Well, that's right. It had nothing to do with
regulation. So much more efficient than they ever were before.
But imagine that's why. But imagine if you had a lot of hoops to jump through, then it wouldn't be the explosion that it is. So, anyways, we're kind of getting off topic there. So again, minimum wage. What it does is it harms the people that it's supposed to help. And Walter Williams talks quite a bit about this. The minorities are specifically harmed by this because the schools in Seattle are no better than they were 30 years ago. They're still awful. If you live in an urban center, and I'm talking about, again, the K through 12 system. So if you have children, and this actually happens, a lot of people there, even though they're liberals, they live in Seattle, they enjoy the kind of Seattle lifestyle, they have kids, and they move, right?
Sure.
Most people move to the suburbs. Yeah. And so Bellevue was kind of the suburbs. I think it's the second or third largest city in Washington. And it's a very nice city. It's clean. It's pretty new. But most importantly, it has, I think, 2 or 3 of the top 10, at least, high schools in the state. Newport High School's not, we're kind of in that district. And so if I had kids, then they would be going there. But a lot of people move to Bellevue because they want to send their kids to that school. But if you're poor and you're making minimum wage, you can't really afford to just up and move, right? Sure. So maybe you live in a poor part of Seattle and you're paying Rainier Beach, or used to be Ballard and places like that, not anymore. Nope. So that was kind of the last place. But people that can't, and so Walter Williams talks about this, and typically those are minorities. Rainier Beach is a mostly black school, and these areas have poor, and we don't have to talk about the reasons for this. I think they're abundant, but they have a poor quality education in most urban-centered schools. I mean, you go to any city in the United States, and the suburbs are where people go because they know the schools are much better.
Oh.
And you tend to have to be middle class or higher in order to just get up and move over to the suburbs. I mean, Bellevue is an expensive area.
Yeah, Bellevue is very expensive. Well, that's the thing, is those suburban schools have a big tax base because, all the middle class and wealthy people live there.
Right, but we could say the same thing about Seattle. I mean, Seattle is very expensive, and so you would think that they would have, the schools there would have a lot of money to play with. In fact, Seattle has a lot of money to play with, but they spend it on other things. That is a whole problem with education. But
yeah, how are you tying this to minimum
again,
wage, though? That's what I'm.
So what he says is that the poor who are typically going to be seeking out minimum wage positions, the minorities that live in these inner city schools, because the wage is much higher, and let's say $15 an hour, it's not in Bellevue, but it is in Seattle. So if they're going to compete with, if you have someone graduating from, again, I could take the local example because you know what it is, Rainier Beach versus Newport High School, and the probability that you go to Newport High School is higher if you're a white middle income student or something, right? Yeah. And so if I'm an employer and I look at your resume without knowing who you are, your name or anything, and I say, graduate of Rainier Beach or graduate of Newport High School, and I have to pay you a minimum $15 an hour, I don't really care about your race, because after all, what is it? I think on the one hand, most liberals would say that businesses are greedy and they care about money, right?
Well, it's certain amount. I mean, yeah, profits matter, right? Keeping your business alive matters, and profits matter too.
Yeah. And so if I'm looking between these two people, I'm saying, well, I think that the student from Newport High School is going to be a better employee than a student from Rainier Beach. Well, it's just, he's going to get a better than he is at Rainier Beach. Most likely, right? I don't really know a whole lot. He's never had a job before. He's 16. He's going to one of these schools. And you could apply this to other schools, other locales as well.
So you're saying that the higher minimum wage makes people more choosy, and so
it definitely makes people more choosy.
You want the best employee, right? No matter what you're paying, right? You want the best guy you can get. But yeah, I mean, that's the idea. Is that and it's simple, basic economics, supply and demand curve. You raise the minimum wage, you push back the supply curve demand. Anyway, you push the curves around, and so you have less people employed, right? Is the natural outcome.
Yeah, and that would be another thing as well. Is you're going to have less people employed, right, but you're also going to
you're going to cut the weakest people first.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so the people that have the poorest education, the people with the poorest education tend to be the minorities because they live in urban population centers that tend also to have the poorest education systems.
Yeah, I guess so.
Right. And Walter Williams goes kind of into great detail in this as well. And of course, he's a famous economist from the George Mason.
Mm-hmm.
Black economist from George Mason.
Heard of him.
So one of my personal favorites, heroes. So anyways, that's kind of the idea of the lowest rung. You get back to the lowest rung on the ladder. You raise the minimum wage, you start removing those rungs on the ladder. It gets more and more difficult to get that first job. And really, it doesn't really matter what the first job is. It's just the first job. You need that first job, something to put on the resume so that you can go to the next employer. Because that first job usually sucks. I know mine did. It was horrible, right? As courtesy clerk.
That's not too bad. I like customer service. I always did, so I'm a friendly guy.
But when you're in that lowest, it's dealing with people in those areas, it can be fun, but it can also be really terrible, right? I mean, depends on the situation. And generally, as a courtesy clerk, it's kind of awful. It's
a hard job.
You just bag groceries, take it out. Yeah. And if it's in the middle of winter, it's harder, right?
Yeah. I did the paper route thing in Alaska, so that was bad.
So okay, there you go.
Yeah.
It's got to be terrible. I couldn't imagine doing that. I used to fill in for people. Then now you're talking about 12 and 13-year-olds with paper routes, those have pretty much been eliminated by,
Well,
it's very difficult to hire a 12-year-old because of labor laws, but
right, it's a little different. Well, and then they contract.
mostly it's adults that do it.
Yeah, that has gone
mostly
to
it's adults
yeah, which is
nowadays.
too bad. I do think, with minimum wage laws, as I was saying, minimum wage, I think, should be aimed at people who are trying to make a living, right? So not teenagers, not kids who live at home with their parents. I don't think minimum wage should apply to them. And I think they should have opportunities to get, I don't think a kid in high school should be working a full-time job. I think it's a terrible idea. But a part-time job is probably a good deal. I don't think they necessarily need to get
20 hours is the limit anyways.
It probably is, yeah. There's usually fairly sensible rules for that. People keep this in mind. And a lot of minimum wage jobs will have that. And they'll also, for minimum wage, won't apply to internships or apprenticeships, some of those kind of situations, so long as you can prove that they're getting some educational value out of it. Also, college students, I don't think it necessarily needs to apply to. Although some college students I worked my way through college, right? I had a job, which was kind of terrible for my education, but what are you going to do, right? You got to do what you got to do. And
better than debt, right? I mean, that's what
I had that too.
Mostly.
I had both. I didn't have traditional debt. I paid for my school, but I had to borrow money for other things, credit card type money. So I came out of college with about 10K in debt, maybe 12, something like that, and some creditors chasing me around, but managed to work my way out of it, right? That's a whole other story. But, I think a minimum wage law has to take into account. It really should only be aimed at people who are trying to make a living for their family. If it's just extra money that you're making, it shouldn't matter. So you should be able to have those early jobs. I just think that once you kind of are out there and you're trying to make a living for yourself, it's important the labor market, if I'm giving you employment and you're dedicating a full day's employment to me and doing a good job, I should be paying you enough to be able to rent an apartment, have some food, and cover the basics of your life. And because of that inequality in the bargaining power, like I said, it should be about trying to push the bargaining power of the labor market. And there's other ways to do that. Unions, guaranteed income, welfare even has some effect on that. You're trying to give them a way to be able to negotiate a little higher wage that's actually worth the labor that they're doing. A high school kid can earn a lot of money, and they can be a great worker. They can deserve it, but employers are always going to lowball them as much as they can. So it's that negotiating crutch that I see as kind of a value. And you don't want to do it in a weak labor market. That's the thing. If you have a really soft labor market, if you got 20% unemployment, minimum wage is a terrible idea, right? It's not going to do you any good, even if you want to establish that floor, because as you say, people are just going to fall out. There's going to be less people. But when you got a hot labor market, when the action is hot, like it is in Seattle or in some other parts of the country, then you're not going to cause unemployment. You're just going to boost up negotiating power of people on the bottom. They're going to make a little bit more money, but everybody's still going to find something because the companies can't, see all this money they can make. They can't make it without workers, so they're going to hire people. Jack it too high, and maybe people will be able to find robots that do all this stuff. That'll probably happen eventually anyway, but
we have seen that happen, right? McDonald's is kind of famous that they're having the little iPad ordering systems.
But employment in Seattle is still low, right? It's record lows.
That gets to another. We kind of talked about it a little bit ago, is the idea of pushing it across the state. Now, they're trying to push $15 an hour in Washington State, which is absurd.
I don't think that's a good idea.
15 in Spokane is pretty good money. I would also point out that you're not talking about raising everybody. I think it's about $10 an hour right now, raising everybody between 10 and 15 up to 15, and then you're done. If you're making 15 today and suddenly the guy that just started last week makes 15, well, I'm going to want 20. And then now the guy that's been here 5 years, he's going to want 25. And you're going to be pushing everybody's wages up. And that's what I think everybody ignores. I've actually never heard anybody talk about that.
I don't know if that happens or not. I'm sure there's some effect on that.
I've talked about this with students of my own in business. And one woman said that she was getting so much an hour, and her friend gets hired, and she's been there like a year, and her friend starts making 50 cents more than her. And she went into her boss and actually broke down in tears that she was so unhappy about this. And I had a couple students say the exact same thing, is that there is a feeling of this is just wrong, that someone, and Gravity Payments is a famous example here, the $72,000 an hour minimum wage for all his employees. And he had some people that had been there from the ground floor working 80 hours a week, and they said yes, yeah, we like the idea, but then they started to think about it in the next couple of days, and they, wait a minute, this isn't right. Someone's going to come in and work the front office, and they're going to make. And I've been here from the ground floor, and I've been here 80 hours a week in the beginning. I'm working my ass off, and suddenly they're going to be making exactly what I'm making. It's not fair. It's wrong.
It doesn't even wrong.
And they quit.
I don't care what other people make. People should get as much money as they can. I don't care what they get. I think it's mean-spirited to say,
I don't care what other people.
I deserve more than Joe. Nah, you deserve what you can negotiate for. That's what you deserve. And
Well, yes, but that's not. They weren't negotiating for this, right? The guy was saying, "Hey, we're going to have a minimum wage, and everybody's going to make the same amount." And I would point to Atlas Shrugged and his 20th Century Motor Company, right? Have you read that?
Yeah, I find Ayn Rand to be a pain in the ass, but yeah, okay.
Well, I mean, just the 20th Century Motor Company, right? It's a little story within. It's in fact, it is John Galt, right?
So in the beginning, simplification of these
from his well, no, because it's Marx, right? From him with ability to him with need, and it talks about. I have asked students. I was like, "What do you think? You're a young person with no family. You can work 60 hours a week, and I got this person with a single mom with 3 kids. She should work 10 hours a week. She needs 65,000 a year. You need 20,000 a year. You're going to work 60 hours a week, make 20 a year. She's going to work 10 hours a week, make 65 a year.
But that doesn't happen.
Seems fair, right?
But it doesn't happen.
No, but there
is a degree. I mean, I made
what they're pushing.
I guess. I mean, I made 6 figures when I was at the end of my career in the software business. Right, I was making big banks. And did I work harder than the guy that comes in and clean the toilets? No, not even close. I mean, that guy had to scrub toilets all day. He's got a strict schedule. He's got to wham, bam, get that thing done, go to the next place. What do I got to do? I sit around. I read Facebook part of the day. I write some code. I go to some meetings.
Agree that hard work doesn't really mean anything, right? Hard work doesn't really mean anything.
It's what you can
kind of skill value you add to the company. It's subjective value.
And lucky a little bit too, right? So, but the thing, I guess my point is, I don't begrudge what other people get, right? I think that's just mean-spirited for the most part. They get what they can get. And I think everybody deserves, if you're putting in a full day, you deserve to be able to pay your rent and buy food for your kids.
Well, what happened to
drive work and back? You know what I mean? Why would I want to deny that to somebody? I don't, even if they're a little lame or lazy or whatever it is, like I want them to be able to make a living.
Well, what happened to aren't you for the equal pay for equal work?
No, I'm not a communist or a socialist. I'm a free market.
Well, okay, let me come to another point.
Socialism and some of these programs are good for balancing society and for fixing inequalities in the marketplace.
So let me just point out that what I'm saying here is, if your employer wants to pay you that's fine, but these people did quit because they realized, they said, this is not fair. It's not right. So I think and by the way, we were saying gravity payments is a stupid idea, but the guy's free to do it, right? It's his own company. He started in his dorm room, one of those. He was making $1 million a year, and now last I read, he was struggling. Actually, saw him last year at the Washington Policy dinner. If you're Washington Policy Center, I volunteered, and he was at the dinner. I looked at, who is that guy? I was like, oh my God, that's it. So anyways, you talked about the kind of, you didn't say it, but you got towards the idea of what Mark said was the exploitation of the laborer, because he's not getting paid for the value that he contributes to the company.
That's a communist socialist line. Now, I don't buy into socialism because I agree on that point in some cases, but yeah.
Right, but it was, you did get to that, and it was a Marx. He said that rise up, you're being exploited by your employers.
And that happens when people get exploited too much, right? That's one of the reasons we don't want to do it.
Well, yeah, that's what he was saying, anyways. Yeah. But it didn't really happen. I think people are not actually exploited though, because I ask people, like, if you're in construction or you're in software, right? Yeah. So you would develop a software, and it would take how long to actually develop the software?
I don't know. It just depends on the piece of software. Anywhere from a day to a couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, it could be a couple of years, right? You're talking like maybe a major piece, a new Windows, right?
Sure.
The Windows 10 or whatever comes out. And Windows 11 is going to come out maybe a year or two, or whenever they can get it done. Is there anybody in your team that, because no doubt Microsoft makes more money off the labor that you produce, the code you produce, than you get paid for it, right?
Yeah, probably. Oh, I'm sure. Yeah, absolutely. Not every developer. I've seen some probably cost the company money, but it's
yeah. Yeah, so you talked about Facebook and checking.
I'd like to think
your
I was a valuable employee, right? Yeah, I try to provide value.
Yeah. So maybe a more applicable example would be something like I had somebody that worked in the winery around here.
Mhm.
So a winery from the time the grapes are being harvested to the time those grapes actually get sold as wine could be a couple of years. They age it, they do whatever. Now maybe the person harvesting the grapes gets paid $10 an hour, and he actually in the long run contributes $20 every hour towards the production of that wine. Is he being exploited? Well, I would say, okay, would you be willing to wait 5 years to get your paycheck of $20 an hour?
Oh, man, well, yeah,
or would you write like 10 now?
If you do a startup,
right? Or would you rather
always
have your
wait
10
on
now?
your money, but
but then
sometimes
you can wait, and you're expecting a huge payoff.
Yeah, it just depends.
But so most people, and I think you'd be hard pressed to find somebody that would say, yes, I'm willing to wait. A construction worker who's building a building, right? He's getting $25-$30 an hour. You're contributing maybe $50 an hour in the long run towards this building. So we're going to give you the option. We're going to pay you $25 an hour now, or in 10 years, we're going to send you a check. When we start profiting, we start making an actual profit. We're going to send you a check of $50 an hour for whatever you contributed 10 years ago. Are you willing to work 40 hours a week and then wait 10 years to see if maybe your check comes through?
It just depends.
Because there's that risk.
Yeah, it's risk.
Right.
Yeah.
And I don't think, and that's what the entrepreneur is doing. Sure. He is putting forth a huge amount of risk. And in fact,
when he's first starting his business,
cases,
right? But I mean, a lot of companies have been running for 100 years. They're no longer trying to pay off their investment. They're just making money.
Right, but you're talking. I mean, we're seeing buildings go not from here, luckily, but there's a big park right there. Yeah. So Mercer Slough, if you're familiar with that,
well,
over in Bellevue.
And ultimately,
there's like no buildings going up, but that I can see. But if you're putting up a building, that building is not going to be making money for quite some time.
It's not going to be making profit. It'll make revenue, right? But not profit for quite some time.
Well, it's not even make revenue for at least
as
year,
you're constructing
right?
it. Yeah, makes sense. Yes.
Yeah. And so the person pouring the footings, the foundation, I'm seeing buildings go up. It's like 5 on a block or something in
Capital
Bellevue.
Has value.
And so the people doing that.
But we do have a long history, right? There's a long history of exploitation of labor in America, from slavery to sharecropping to factory children working in factories. And there's a long history of labor movements and progressives trying to stop some of those activities and to make things better. And same with safety regulations of the workplace, health regulations in food processing, so on and so. I mean, we have a long history of both these things. And I know that you're kind of a hardcore free market guy, but we had that in the past, and we had a lot of problems too. And those problems are what got people to create these kinds of regulations.
Well, I would point out that slavery, Jim Crow, sharecropping, these were all laws, right?
Sure.
So these were a part of the governmental process.
Yes and no. I mean, slavery was private property, right? There was no law that said you can have slaves.
Well,
right? It was we are not allowed to take your private property, aka your slaves, from you. The only legal thing was to say that those people were not treated as citizens or protected by the rights of the country. I mean, it was a law defining them as the ability to be property instead of.
Well, remember they had the slave. What was the North had the Slave Return Act, right?
Right. Yeah. In the Constitution,
where if they caught them, the government would return.
Right.
So these were laws. These were government enforced.
Yeah. It's terrible.
But, yes, it was. Jim Crow laws were laws. The private industry, the market didn't want them to exist. Like talking about bus boycott, they boycotted the bus. The bus company said in one day said, we give up. You sit wherever you want. The government said, no, you can't do that. You must.
I'd agree with you. Regulations can cut both ways. Laws can create exploitation, and they can remove it. It just depends. Yeah, but.
And I would also say that even child labor. We can talk about child labor, but child labor was just a result. I mean, child labor exists today around the world. It's just a result of poverty, right? I mean, if it takes 5 people to produce enough income and money and goods to feed 5 people, you're going to have 5 people work, even if they're 10 years old.
Yeah, but see, the thing is, when you remove them from the labor market, though, I mean, the stuff still gets made. It's not like.
But it doesn't.
Well, no, it does. I mean, we got rid of child labor laws in the United States. Production did not go down.
That was after. Well, no, that was after production increased to the point to where you could have child labor laws without affecting the economy.
Maybe, but if we didn't make a law, they would have continued.
Oh no, because I mean, are you saying
would
that
just
parents
stop
are
hiring
evil?
children at
So
a cheap rate?
yeah,
I mean, I don't think that's realistic.
yes, because and Tom Woods points this out. It's awful strange that all the worst parents in the world happen to live in third world countries, right?
Right, but
Like the worst parents in the world.
Have you? I don't know. I'll look it up. I haven't looked it up, but I can't think of one country
and of
that
course,
doesn't have child labor that doesn't have a law against child labor.
Oh, they've got laws against child labor in Bangladesh. All around the world, they have laws against child labor, but people ignore them because if you were actually to enforce these child labor laws, you'd have mass starvation. I guess I got the boycotts in Bangladesh that caused mass starvation there. The T-shirt project by NPR's Planet Money, they did a whole project, and they went into Bangladesh, and I won't go into that, but I will just say that in countries, they have minimum wage laws, and a lot of them ignore the minimum wage law because if you're actually going to enforce the minimum wage law, a lot of these factories would just leave, right? They go there because it's a poor country.
They go there to exploit workers, right? I mean, that's what they're doing.
Well, they don't exploit them because
if they were in America, they would be paying a much higher value, right? So they're like, well, we'll forget that. I mean, maybe that's a good price for an American, but if we go down to Venezuela, hey, yeah, for these guys, they're not worth as much as an American is. We'll pay them less.
I will point out in Bangladesh, and
that's exploitation.
I just point them out because they make a lot of T-shirts, but it's a very poor country. Yeah. They're not exploiting them because they hire mostly women, young women, and these women, they have three options. Well, previously they had two options: starve or be a sex slave.
Sure.
Now they get to be a factory worker.
Yeah, so it's slightly less exploitive.
From my point of view, starvation, sex slave. Right. Child labor. Well, in some cases they are child labor, but factory worker. Factory worker.
They have a gun to their head, right, and the company takes advantage of the fact that if they can't work at the factory, they're going to be a sex slave or going to starve to death. And so we can get cheap labor from them, more profit for me. I get to make more money. It's awesome. And these guys, well, it's better for them than it was, which is nice. I mean, that's a plus. I'm going to say it's a plus, right, in net. But ultimately, they could pay those people more and still make a profit, right? Those people could not just have subsistence lives. They could have really good lives, but we're not going to do that because we don't have to, because they don't have much negotiating power, because big companies have tons of negotiating power. And that's that whole economic problem. If they went into Bangladesh and they paid American wages, can you imagine how that would revolutionize those people's lives and how it would spread out into the economy? I mean, maybe they wouldn't be there if they didn't, if everybody in the world had to, be the same, well, maybe they wouldn't be in Bangladesh. So sure, there are some external factors that say Bangladesh, a little bit less valuable to have a factory, so maybe we pay a little bit less wages. But if there wasn't that kind of exploitation, if they didn't go seek out people who were desperate, they would have to pay them more. And if they did pay, and they could still make a profit. And so they're still wringing out as much as they can. And that's what the exploitation is about. It doesn't mean like, the companies are just going to vanish if we force people a little bit to be a bit more fair. It just means that the bottom line, they make a little bit less profit. But that extra money is going to go to people who need it in order to establish their life. And then you grow the middle class in those societies, and that's going to trickle out into the economy. And there's a lot of advantages to that.
Well, I would say they wouldn't be there. And if they did have to pay them a significantly higher wage, people would buy a lot less T-shirts and they would be hiring a lot less people. And the fact that they are there and they're paying them what they pay them, which is a very good wage in those countries. I mean, you look at we can go to China, of course. China, right? They have a lot of factories. And when those factories hire just 100 people, they get thousands of people that will just rush the gates. I mean, Nightline did a special on we talk about in the U.S. how terrible it is. But again, it's terrible to us. But again, you look at where they are, their lot in life in that country. And I would say mostly because of immense regulations and other things that have, usually poverty is a government problem, but that's a whole nother thing we don't have 50 seconds to discuss it, but
another time.
Yeah, but it is a vastly better life, and they pay them what we would say is a low wage, but to them it changes their life. It's a vastly better lifestyle. They have enough money to live, and they eat more meat Vegetarian it's a Western word, right? Vegetarian, like people in the East and in these poor countries, like vegetarian. What are you, insane? You have enough money to buy meat.
I'll just say one more thing. If they're making a living wage the way they can afford the cost of living where they live, then I'm fine with that.
Yeah. So again, in 14 seconds, minimum wage. I think if we got rid of minimum wage, we would have a lot more people hired, and we could have lower prices. So, and that goes to the prices that they pay for these people in Bangladesh, and it'd be more expensive